Have you ever wondered what would happen if an old man dared to say no in a world built on a silent compliance? And if the price of one simple act of intervention was to be beaten within an inch of your life? This isn't just a case of police brutality. This is the story of a community pushed to the margins and a family forced to confront its own fractures in order to rise. You'll meet an old pastor still holding on to his faith in goodness, a son once a special forces soldier now lost after the war, and a daughter an idealistic lawyer burning out between case files no one reads. But it all began on a cold night when a 73-year-old man stepped out of a corner store with a few sandwiches and saw a young boy being forced against a wall. Walker's corner store always kept its lights on late into the night. Maggie the cashier used to joke, if Pastor Elijah Cross ever stopped handing out food at midnight, this neighborhood wouldn't sleep right. Elijah would just smile, his eyes warm behind old glasses. At 73, he wasn't as strong as he used to be, but that had never stopped him from doing what was right. That night was bitter cold. He bought a few hand warmers, some personal supplies, and enough sandwiches to feed at least 10 people. He walked out of the store, plastic bags swinging gently from his hands, taking slow steps down Gibson Street, the same street he'd walked for over 20 years to reach the shelter at the end of the block. But when he turned into the alley near Maple Avenue, everything stopped. A young black teenager no older than 16 was trembling against a brick wall. Two plainclothes men stood over him. They weren't in uniform, but the badges tucked beneath their jackets said everything. Elijah could have turned away. He could have kept walking like he'd seen nothing. But he chose to step closer. He chose to ask a question, and just moments later he was on the ground. A blow to the ribs, a fall onto frozen concrete, a boot stomping down on the voice of an old man because he dared to say, "Wait, this child has no weapon." What those officers didn't know was that the man they were beating was the father of a former soldier trained to neutralize an entire unit in minutes. A son who had disappeared from this city for 8 long years. But now he was coming back. And this time he wasn't bringing weapons. He was bringing the truth. This story isn't just about one family. It's about an entire system. And why, when one man stands up, sometimes an entire city listens. Walker's Corner Store had something distinct. Something you'd only find in neighborhoods slowly being reshaped. A tiny shop nestled between two freshly painted buildings, its old sign worn, but still familiar to the locals. That night, Maggie, the aging cashier, smiled softly when she saw Elijah step in, holding a carefully handwritten shopping list. "Midnight run again, Mr. Cross, Elijah." She would often say, "You're going to give my heart a scare one day." Elijah just smiled, his eyes behind thick lenses radiating peace. At 73, he kept the same quiet routine night after night, gathering small things. Food packs, hand warmers, bars of soap. Then he would quietly weave his way through the city's forgotten corners, delivering comfort to those who had no place to call home. Elijah didn't do it for recognition. He didn't do it because he was told to. He did it because he believed it was the right thing to do. That night was no different, until he turned into the alley near Maple Street. There, 2 men in plain clothes were pressing a young boy against a brick wall. The boy trembled, whispering something over and over. Elijah could hear the words clearly. "I swear, I don't have anything. I just want to go home." The taller man stepped closer, voice sharp. "Then why'd you run? People with nothing to hide don't run." Elijah gently set his bags down and stepped forward, his voice calm and deliberate, like he was walking up to the pulpit once more. "Good evening, officers. Is everything all right?" The boy seems frightened. That sentence, kind, unthreatening, was enough to change everything. No shouting, no resistance, just a man asking, "Is something wrong here?" And yet that was the moment Elijah was struck. A powerful blow to the chest, his arms yanked behind his back, then the crack of bone, a muffled groan, lips bloodied. A homeless man hidden in the shadows quietly lifted his phone. He recorded the aftermath. But no one captured the beginning, when Elijah had simply stood still because he saw a child being treated like a criminal. No one knew Elijah had once been a pastor who spent his life building a modest community center in a quiet corner of the neighborhood. No one knew he had taught reading classes for children who didn't have a single book at home. No one knew or cared that he was doing what any decent human being should, refusing to ignore a child's fear. There's something strange about modern society. When people turn away, they don't think of themselves as being silent. They simply think, that's not my business. But it is that very silence, that quiet turning away, that allows thousands of innocent lives to disappear in the noise of the system. Elijah didn't turn away, and the price he paid was having his own life placed on the edge. In a world that keeps turning because of silence, sometimes all it takes is a gentle voice, one willing to ask, what's happening here, to spark a fire. And sometimes that fire can burn down a whole chain of links built from fear, lies, and unchecked power. A few days later, the headlines read, elderly man assaults officers during routine police stop. The video carefully edited, the narrative blurred. No one knew the man in the footage was the father of a former soldier who had once vanished into the deep woods. No one knew Cameron Cross was on his way back, not out of rage, but because he needed to know what had his quiet father said. And when a soldier quietly returns home carrying truth and a flicker of belief still intact, the story is no longer his alone. It becomes the story of an entire city. There's something strange about modern society. When people turn away, they don't think of themselves as being silent. They simply think, that's not my business. But it is that very silence, that quiet turning away, that allows thousands of innocent lives to disappear in the noise of the system. Elijah didn't turn away, and the price he paid was having his own life placed on the edge. In a world that keeps turning because of silence, sometimes all it takes is a gentle voice, one willing to ask, what's happening here, to spark a fire. And sometimes that fire can burn down a whole chain of links built from fear, lies, and unchecked power. A few days later, the headlines read, elderly man assaults officers during routine police stop. The video carefully edited, the narrative blurred. No one knew the man in the footage was the father of a former soldier who had once vanished into the deep woods. No one knew Cameron Cross was on his way back, not out of rage, but because he needed to know what had his quiet father said. And when a soldier quietly returns home carrying truth and a flicker of belief still intact, the story is no longer his alone. It becomes the story of an entire city. The next day, Cameron arrived at the hospital. No one recognized him, the man in a plain gray t-shirt expression, blank eyes cold from years of combat. But when he stepped into the ICU room, where Elijah lay unconscious, every layer of armor he had ever worn fell away. The father who once stood strong through storms now breathed through oxygen tubes, his face bruised, lips torn. Cameron sat down beside him. He didn't cry. He didn't speak. He just looked. He had grown used to not being able to save anyone. But this time, it was his father. Because the pain of war doesn't just belong to the battlefield, it follows survivors home, and if no one is there to meet them, it buries them in silence. But sometimes it only takes a phone call, a memory, a voice reminding you still have a place to return to. Elijah remained unconscious, but Cameron didn't leave. That night, for the first time in 8 years, he slept in the room he grew up in, still filled with the smell of old books and the faint echoes of his father's prayers from an old cassette player. The next morning, when he stepped out into the street, Cameron was no longer the soldier in hiding. He had become a man searching for the truth. And the first thing he noticed was that the neighborhood he grew up in was vanishing. Some changes come like dust collecting on a windowsill. You don't notice it until one day the light shining through that window no longer belongs to you. Cameron walked through the streets of his childhood and began to notice something odd. The corner stores he once knew were now artisan cafes. The old school had become a co-working space for startups. And the house where Marcus, the boy his father had protected, used to live, had a notice pinned to the door, scheduled for demolition due to structural violations. At first he thought it was coincidence, but the more he walked, the clearer it became. A disturbing pattern. The deeper Cameron looked, the clearer it became. The streets with the highest number of black residents were the ones disappearing fastest. The families who refused to sell their homes were the ones suddenly having trouble with the police. And at the center of it all was the silence of the system. Aaron, the once troubled kid Elijah had brought into rehab, was now a father, a steady man raising his son. He was the first to show Cameron the full picture. They're clearing this place out, but not with bulldozers. They're using lawsuits, eviction orders, and badges. One name kept coming up in every story Cameron heard from the community: Urban Vista Holdings, a real estate development company publicly known for revitalizing underperforming neighborhoods. But beneath the surface were shady buyout contracts, property values that mysteriously dropped after police incidents and quiet warnings that said you'd better sell before trouble finds you. Elijah had been documenting these events in notebooks, handwritten letters, and community meetings no one ever reported on. He used to tell people, "I'm not against development. I'm against erasure. We don't need high-rises if they're built on threats and the blood of the innocent." In truth, this wasn't just about one neighborhood. From Brooklyn to Oakland, from Detroit to Atlanta, Black communities across America were being hit by the same wave of redevelopment, families forced to sell below market value, sudden police presence before property appraisals, community centers like the one Elijah ran being slapped with constant inspection notices, and those who resisted slowly disappearing from the frame. The problem wasn't development itself. The problem was that the right to exist of the poor was seen as an obstacle to progress. In the battle between growth and preserving values, the voices of ordinary people were rarely heard, and when police, those meant to protect, become tools of financial interests. It's no longer urban planning, it's a war, a silent war strategically coordinated, and in that war, the most vulnerable are always the first to fall. Cameron stood in front of the community center his father had once run. The sign was still there, but the glass was cracked, the locks had been changed, and a newly posted notice read, "This facility is pending administrative review. No tanks, no sirens, just a bureaucratic hammer enough to crush an entire legacy." Cameron knew then he wasn't just investigating a beating. He was stepping into a labyrinth of power, money, and complicity. And to expose it, he needed more than memory. He needed names. He needed proof. He needed to trace the orders back to the people who had truly pulled the strings. Some people don't need a stage to shine. They don't make speeches. They don't run for office. They don't write fiery op-eds. They simply keep doing the right thing quietly, day by day, year after year, until the world is finally forced to stop and listen. Elijah Cross was one of those people. He wasn't a professional activist. He had no legal team behind him, no press following him around. Just an old church tucked inside a modest neighborhood, a tiny community center, and an unshakable belief in human transformation. His story didn't begin the night he was attacked. It began 20 years earlier, when he first opened the Washington Community Center. At that time, the neighborhood was in crisis. Unemployment was soaring. School dropout rates were climbing. Social programs were being slashed piece by piece. Elijah didn't have major grants. What he had was time, patience, and a pair of open hands always ready to lift someone out of the pit. Aaron, one of the many he helped, had once been a lost kid, caught stealing, battling addiction, stripped of custody over his child. And yet Elijah was the one who brought him to rehab, stood in as temporary guardian, and sent him a short note every Sunday morning. Any wrong turn can become a straight path if you stop and choose a new direction. Years later, Aaron not only turned his life around, he became the first to help Cameron uncover the silent invasion targeting their community. And Aaron wasn't the only one. There was Marcus, the boy Elijah had taught to read in the second grade, the same boy he stood up for on the night everything changed. There was Mr. Jefferson Taylor, a former city inspector, who kept copies of falsified reports after Elijah warned him something was wrong. Elijah didn't save the world. He simply refused to abandon anyone. When Urban Vista began acquiring buildings near the church, Elijah was the only one who declined every offer. They sent people to negotiate, invited him to lunch, offered to fund a new center. Elijah just smiled and replied, "I don't sell prayers, and I won't name a price for a place that taught children they matter." But saying no had its consequences. Every time he ran a food drive, police happened to stop by for a check. Every time he posted flyers about tenant rights, they vanished by morning. One night, the church windows were smashed, no arrests followed. At a community meeting, a stranger showed up just to say, "Old man, it's time you stepped aside." Not all battles need shouting. Some, like Elijah's, only require the courage to stay. He didn't rant online. He didn't ask for help. He just stayed when everyone else had left. When Cameron opened his father's old journal, he found hundreds of carefully written entries. Each one was a thread in a larger web. Jackson family, declined second offer, targeted with surprise inspection. Thompson home, sold after son, arrested for possession, no evidence record found. Offer made for the community center, $1.3 million. Response refused. They will come back. And beneath every page, a quiet prayer. May they keep their faith even if I'm no longer here to protect them. Cameron set the journal down, his fist clenched. For the first time in years, he understood why his father had never left, and why now he couldn't stay on the sidelines anymore. Some wounds don't bleed, but they run so deep, people must walk far away before they can even bear to look back. The Cross family had three members left: a father who had lived his whole life in quiet sacrifice, a son scarred by war and silence, and a daughter who had become so strong no one dared ask, "Are you tired?" And between them stood a gulf of time, pain, and all the things left unsaid. Naomi Cross was Cameron's younger sister, a civil rights lawyer who had spent most of her career helping families like her father's keep their homes. Naomi didn't carry a gun. She didn't break down doors like Cameron had. She fought with case files, legal clauses, and paragraphs buried deep in appeals no one ever finished reading. When Cameron returned, Naomi didn't welcome him with open arms. Instead, she asked one piercing question: "So what is it this time? Are you staying or just passing through again?" Cameron didn't answer, because he knew that question wasn't just anger. It was the voice of someone who had waited and never been answered. When their mother passed, it was Naomi who stood by her bedside. She was the one who placed her mother's hands into the casket. She was the one who answered their mother's final question. Will Cameron come with a silent shake of her head, too ashamed to look her in the eye? Cameron had been at the airport, one day too late. It was something they had never spoken of, until now when their father, the final piece of the family, lay unconscious amidst beeping machines. And they both realized if they didn't reach for each other now, there might be no one left to hold them together. Naomi was the first to help Cameron search for legal evidence against Urban Vista. She already had a file on the two officers who beat Elijah. Both had been accused before, but cleared of wrongdoing. She understood how the system worked. It was built to consume the weak through procedures no one could navigate. "I'm not angry that you left," Naomi told him one night. "I'm angry because Dad waited 8 years for you and never once complained. You left, but you left a hole no one else could fill. Dad didn't just lose you, I lost you too." Cameron sat quietly for a long time, then finally said, "I wasn't there when Mom died. I was afraid she'd see what I'd become. But Dad, he still looked at me and saw the boy I used to be. And that made it even harder to come home. Because sometimes we get angry at others for leaving, but the truth is we're angry at ourselves for not being brave enough to stay." Families don't fall apart from shouting. They fall apart from everything left unsaid. But sometimes fighting for justice together becomes the very thing that brings broken hearts back home. When Naomi watched Cameron writing code to infiltrate Urban Vista's servers, and when Cameron saw Naomi delivering fierce arguments at a hearing, they weren't just relatives bound by blood anymore. They were teammates in a war their father had quietly begun long ago. That night, as Cameron prepared to leave their father's house, Naomi placed a hand on his shoulder, not saying a word, just one simple sentence. "This time, don't disappear again." Cameron nodded. No oath, just a promise made through presence. Not every battle begins with gunfire. Some are drawn in urban plans, spreadsheets, and zoning maps. And the weapons aren't bullets. They're property records, inspection orders, and lists of names marked for action. Cameron first saw the full picture while examining the city's redevelopment map, a file he and Naomi had accessed through internal data systems. On it, neighborhoods were divided by colored zones: red, special target areas; yellow, transitional zones; green, agreed development areas. It seemed harmless until he overlaid those zones with demographic data, race, income levels, and housing status. Then the pattern became undeniable. The poorer, the blacker, the more likely the area was a target. They never said it outright. Instead, they used terms that sounded benign: intervention zones, relocation support, compliance enforcement. But behind those terms was a seamless machine. Police were deployed more heavily in red zones, even when crime rates weren't high. Young people were arrested for petty reasons, walking without ID, gathering after 10 p.m. Families were quietly documented as problematic, adding legal pressure. A few weeks later, real estate agents showed up. If you want peace, you should consider selling. Urban Vista wasn't acting alone. Evidence pulled from the server showed direct ties with the Department of Buildings, the Planning Commission, and the Welfare Agency. Contracts for neighborhood security consulting, which essentially meant hiring off-duty police officers to maintain order in designated zones. Elijah had long suspected something, but never had the evidence. All he knew was that every time he refused to sell the community center, something strange happened. Once a plumbing system failure appeared out of nowhere, and he was forced to replace the entire water line despite no actual damage. Another time, city inspectors arrived for a structural safety check, though the building had never reported a single incident. The last straw, the church was listed as non-optimal land use property. Because modern oppression doesn't always come with brute force. Sometimes it comes with stamped signatures and silence. People aren't driven out at gunpoint. They're erased through procedures so polished and legal, they feel inescapable. That too is violence only dressed in paperwork. Cameron called it an undeclared war. He knew because he'd fought in ones just like it. Back in the Army, he had taken part in overseas operations with names eerily familiar. Zone stabilization, hearts and minds campaigns, community realignment. The most terrifying realization: those same strategies were now being used here on American soil. In a classified folder buried deep in the server, Cameron found an email from Colin Vance, his former commanding officer in the military, now CEO of Sentinel Capital, the parent company behind Urban Vista. The message was brief, cold, tactical. Cross Center is a key node in Phase 3. If the pastor won't sell, increase pressure. Code enforcement, fire risk, use what's necessary. There was no room for interpretation. This wasn't suspicion anymore. It was an order. And behind every order stood a human life damaged, a home lost, a community shredded into fragments. Cameron turned to Naomi, who was staring at the bolded words on the screen. Her voice dropped to a whisper. They've programmed the system to erase anyone who doesn't generate profit. But even the most efficient system has cracks. And if they could stay patient, sharp, and brave, truth would eventually pour through those cracks. But truth, once revealed, doesn't only terrify the powerful. It also puts the powerless in danger. Elijah had dared to speak the truth. Cameron and Naomi had connected the dots, exposed what had once seemed unrelated. But each step toward the light meant someone else might pay the price. The first to pay the price was Jefferson Taylor, the former building inspector who had refused to falsify reports so Urban Vista could coerce homeowners. After giving Cameron a vital packet of documents, he agreed to testify at a lawyer's office. But he never made it. The news reported it plainly: dies of a stroke in his sleep. A 42-year-old man, healthy, a regular jogger. Naomi held his medical records from a previous racial discrimination lawsuit. Heart strong, blood pressure stable, no history of illness. She looked at Cameron, her voice caught in her throat. They didn't just silence his testimony. They tried to erase the fact that he ever stood with us at all. Next came Aaron, once a broken young man saved by Elijah, now a father, a baseball coach for the local kids. Aaron had told Cameron, I'll testify. But you have to promise me protect my son, Cameron promised. But days later, Aaron was found dead in an alleyway, 3 blocks from where Marcus worked. Official cause of death, drug overdose. Marcus stood frozen when he heard the news. That's not possible. He'd been clean for 4 years, no smoking, no drinking. He coached every Tuesday evening. But the media only ran a single line. A black man with a drug history found dead under suspicious circumstances. No name, no photo, no story, because in a society designed to blur the truth, the death of someone like Aaron wasn't enough to shake the ground. They hadn't just killed a man, they killed the way he would be remembered. Cameron stood by his father's window, watching a patrol car circle the block for the 3rd time that day. Naomi entered, quietly set down a mug of coffee, her gaze steely. The closer we get, the more they unravel. If Aaron had to die, then we will not let them erase him like he never existed. This isn't an investigation anymore, Cam. This is a fight. That night, they held a spontaneous vigil in the alley where Aaron was found. Hundreds came. Elders brought candles. Children wrote Aaron's name in white chalk on the pavement. A small group quietly sang, We Shall Overcome, a song Elijah had taught during summer classes at the community center. Naomi stepped forward, voice trembling slightly but clear. They want us to be afraid. They want us to be silent. But every death is a spark. And we are the forest. Cameron stayed at the edge of the crowd, watching the faces of those his father had once lifted up. They wore no armor, had no legal shields, but they had each other. And in that moment, Cameron understood this fight was no longer about asking, "Who hurt my father?" It had become about something far bigger. How do we make sure no one else has to live and die in silence like this ever again? Every journey for justice reaches a breaking point, a decision, to stay in the shadows or to step into the light and let the world see what's been hidden. For the Cross family and for the people around them, that moment had come. The living room of Elijah's modest home became a makeshift broadcasting studio. No professional lights, no production crew, just a laptop, a couple of small cameras, sunlight streaming in through the windows, and a truth that could no longer stay hidden. Amamira, a nurse who had long worked with Elijah, stood quietly behind the control setup. Naomi adjusted her blazer, carefully organizing the stack of papers in front of her. Cameron stood just outside the frame, fists clenched, eyes locked on his father, still bruised, still healing but more alert than ever. 5 seconds. Amamira counted down softly. 3, 2, 1. The red light blinked on. Naomi looked straight into the camera lens and began to speak, not with theatrics, not with drama, but with unshakable truth. My name is Naomi Cross. I'm a civil rights attorney. And this is my father, Elijah Cross, 73 years old, who was beaten nearly to death by police because he tried to protect a child from being wrongfully arrested. The live stream wasn't just a story, it was a dossier, a digital archive, a weapon made of evidence. One by one, they laid out the facts. Unedited video footage of the entire incident. Property records showing buyouts that followed acts of police violence. Pages from Elijah's journals documenting families harassed into leaving. Emails from Urban Vista Holdings instructing teams to increase pressure on the community center. There were no fancy effects, no music, just the quiet voices of people who had suffered long enough in silence. At minute 22, the stream began to glitch. Viewers reported frozen screens, broken audio. Cameron didn't hesitate. He flipped the switch on an old military-grade transmitter used for emergency operations during his service. Backup signal restored. The live stream continued. At minute 37, just as Elijah began to speak, sharing his dream for a better future, the entire block lost power. But they were ready for that too. A small backup generator hummed to life. Amamira gave a nod. The satellite feed reconnected. The truth kept flowing. Power cuts, network attacks, data interference. None of it worked. Because the truth, once set free, had moved beyond anyone's control. Because when a community stands together, prepared, united, fueled by love, and unwavering commitment, no barrier can hold back their voice. Silence may be complicity, but truth once spoken cannot be muted. In under an hour, the stream reached over 200,000 live viewers. Hashtags began to trend. Justice for Elijah. We remember, Aaron, this is our home. Media outlets started calling. Some responded cautiously. Others could no longer look away. One major newspaper broke the silence with a front-page headline, "A family tells the truth. A city has to listen." The police department scrambled to hold a press conference. They claimed the video had been manipulated. They said the community was being provoked by outside influences. But this time no one believed them. Because the truth wasn't just in a video anymore. It was in the collective memory of a people who had been watching and waiting and remembering for years. In the midst of all the noise, Elijah sat quietly, hands clasped in prayer. Cameron sat beside him, silent, watchful. Naomi removed her earpiece and looked out the window where neighbors stood holding signs that read, "We will not be silent anymore." For the first time in years, the Cross family was not alone. Asked her father quietly, "What is justice to you?" Elijah answered with a whisper. "Justice is when a black child can walk home at night without having to explain why he belongs here." Cameron's definition was different. To him, it was when Marcus had the freedom to choose his future rather than run from it. It was when Aaron's past didn't erase the life he rebuilt. It was when a soldier like himself could come home and find his identity not in a weapon, but in what he chose to protect. Because real justice isn't static. It's not a verdict or a line drawn in law books. It's the ongoing work of a community defining its worth on its own terms. It's not about being forgiven. It's about not having to beg to be seen as worthy in the first place. Justice isn't about who gets punished. It's about ensuring no one else has to suffer the same pain again. Cameron once believed he didn't deserve to return home. Elijah once feared no one would believe in the truths he'd quietly recorded. Naomi once thought she was shouting into a void too deep for anyone to hear, but now they had written a new definition of justice, one made not of laws but of lived lives, and in this definition, no one was erased. Everyone had a voice, a story, and a place. One afternoon after a community workshop at the newly opened center, Elijah rose slowly from his chair, leaning on his cane. He turned toward the far wall freshly painted in clean bright white. Along the wall were hundreds of photographs, faces of the community, elders, teenagers, people who had made mistakes but were trying to make things right, people no one used to notice. Under every photograph were the same four words, "I belong here." And maybe that Elijah thought was justice. Not loud, not glamorous, but strong enough to hold the soul of a neighborhood. Because sometimes to change an entire city, you don't need wealth. You don't need titles. You just need one person willing to stop. Not a powerful person, not a wealthy one, just an old pastor walking down a narrow alley seeing a child forced against a wall and choosing to stop. Elijah Cross was no movie hero. He had no cape, no superpowers. What he had was belief. A quiet belief that doing the right thing at the right moment, no matter how small, could change the course of a life. And he had been right. Because from that single act, a soldier returned from the shadows and found himself again. A sister laid down her bitterness and stood for office to fix the system from within. A community raised its head and declared, "We will not be silent." And a city long divided by fear was forced to look in the mirror. So now the question is no longer, what happened to Elijah Cross? It's this: what would you do? Would you stop if you saw someone in need? Would you speak up even if you were the only voice in a room full of silence? Do you believe that one person is enough to start something that could change everything? If Elijah's story moved you, please share this video. You don't have to do something grand. You just have to not scroll past like it never happened. Hit like to support stories that matter. Subscribe if you believe the world needs more people like Elijah. And comment below, "I will stop if someone needs defending." Because sometimes, all it takes to begin real change is one person willing to stop. Thank you for listening to this story. We are That Person Was Me, and maybe that person could be you.